indicates there's advanced negotiations going on between North Korea and Russia, in which North Korea would provide Russia with various munitions that would be used, for their war in Ukraine. Now we know from the White House that North Korea first gave Russia weapons back in late last year, and they hadn't really seen this as an ongoing thing. It was more of a one-time thing that occurred late last year, and the White House was actually forthcoming with information about it at the time. Fast forward to this week, we heard from the same officials that they have intelligence to indicate there's been a sort of revitalization of these negotiations for additional supplies.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there's been some talk here in the U.S. about a troubling collaboration, alliance is probably too strong of a word for it, between Russia and North Korea. What's the latest? What are we so concerned about there?
So we heard earlier this week from the White House that they have seen intelligence that indicates there's advanced negotiations going on between North Korea and Russia, in which North Korea would provide Russia with various munitions that would be used, for their war in Ukraine. Now we know from the White House that North Korea first gave Russia weapons back in late last year, and they hadn't really seen this as an ongoing thing. It was more of a one-time thing that occurred late last year, and the White House was actually forthcoming with information about it at the time. Fast forward to this week, we heard from the same officials that they have intelligence to indicate there's been a sort of revitalization of these negotiations for additional supplies. And so the Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, actually traveled there a couple weeks ago, late last month, and it was one of the first times he'd been there in a long time. And then since then, we heard that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian leader Vladimir Putin have exchanged letters, not going into significant detail about a partnership, but trying to get through that process. And so the U.S. officials have actively warned North Korea not to go through with this,
right?
Because this would be in violation of UN resolutions.
So this has come after, Russia's been using Iranian drones. There's been all kinds of discussion about what level of cooperation exists between Russia and China. Russia does seem to be aligning with other adversaries, the United States, or bad actors on the global stage.
That's exactly right. This war has really cemented a U.S. Versus Russia sort of outlook from both sides. And so with the U.S. actively putting pressure on Russia through sanctions to stop its war in Ukraine, they're also actively trying to prevent, would-be aids from acting as such. And so one is North Korea, but the predominant one that you mentioned is Iran.
Sure.
Russia has, acquired hundreds of Iranian drones that are very cheap to make and are very actually unsophisticated, which is why they've been used so well, because Russia has used them to target Ukrainian infrastructure on these one-way attack drones where they just aim at a target, and then they get to the target, they hit the target, and they detonate. And so Russia has really relied on Iran in particular, but they've also sought out North Korea. There have been indications that they've sought to provide, get weapons from China, though the U.S. has not seen that happen to date, according to White House and defense officials.
Right.
The U.S. really is concerned about the possibility of Russia strengthening its ties with some of the U.S.'s adversaries, as you mentioned, and how that could affect Ukraine.
So one of the more global effects of the Russian war in Ukraine has concerned food security. What's sort of the outlook there, and why are people so worried about how this war impacts that?
So Russia and Ukraine both are some of the largest exporters of grain for the world. Whether it's wheat, corn, barley, they rank among global leaders in these exports. And so we saw prices skyrocket during the first 6 months of the war, when almost all Ukrainian exports essentially halted. In July of 2022, the UN and Turkey brokered an agreement known as, the grain deal, as it's colloquially been called, where it allowed Ukrainian exports to start leaving its ports. That deal, although it took a couple iterations that expired and then restarted, was in place for about a year. According to Secretary Blinken, 35 million tons of grain left Ukraine in that year, just to give you some sense of how significant it is. And since then, last month, Russia pulled out of the agreement, essentially saying they wanted more concessions from Ukraine and the West to allow this to happen. In that time, we've seen prices start to go up a little bit, and there was a report that was released this week from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence that indicated Ukraine was operating on about 1/3, or had lost about 1/3 of their, acreage that they were using for their crops over the course of the war so far in the last 18 months. So not only are less exports leaving the country, they have less land for new exports to come. And not only that, we've seen Russia, since they pulled out of the deal, target Ukraine's export infrastructure. So it really has been a wide, almost plot or plan from the Russians to harm Ukraine's grain infrastructure and its exports as a whole.
So we've seen some video resurface of the Russian mercenary leader who is widely believed to have been taken out by the Kremlin in retaliation for his mutiny against Vladimir Putin. What, if anything, did we learn from that?
So in this video that you mentioned was released earlier this week, almost 2 weeks after Yevgeny Prigozhin's purported death in a plane crash, he actually downplayed what people assumed was he was referencing threats against him.
Right.
And he said it wasn't an issue. He wasn't concerned. And it's believed that the backdrop of this video was during a recent trip he took to Africa, where the Wagner Group really does a lot of Russia's bidding.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, he mentioned in the video, it was mid-August and it was the weekend. So it was believed that it was not this past weekend, but the weekend before it, when this video was taking place, based on sort of how he was talking and the dates he was referencing. And so he was, allegedly killed in this plane crash just days later.
Right.
And so there really is a belief that this could be one of the last videos of him alive. That being said, it actually was him expressing, downplaying these threats, though we now know, as the U.S. and Russian officials have said, he was killed. So it really is a little bit of a 180 based on, the feelings he was portraying outwardly, at least, in the days leading up to his death.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.